Welcome to today's presentation on religious conflict, demographic crisis, technological innovation, and luck. I want to think a little bit about the context of European exploration in what Europeans will call the New World, but of course is certainly not new to the indigenous peoples who had discovered it 10,000 years before, 10,000 years or more before. So one of the things that really sort of frames the beginning of this history is religious conflict, primarily between Catholics and Muslims in present-day Spain and Portugal. This is the Iberian Peninsula, right? And until the 1400s, this region is occupied by some fairly economically successful and very culturally productive Muslim kingdoms, where in fact Christians, Muslims, and Jews live side by side. But beginning in the 1200s and 1300s, there is a process called the Reconquista, where Christian kingdoms on the Iberian Peninsula will try to push those Muslim kingdoms basically off the European continent. And in fact, that is what happens. It is a long process, and it concludes in 1492, the same year, in fact, that Columbus first lands his ships on those Caribbean islands. So, at any rate, the second form of religious conflict is one that is kind of lurking in the background here, but will become more important for next week's lectures, and that is the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation is occurring mostly in central northern Europe, not so much on the Iberian Peninsula or in southern Europe, but there are pockets of Protestant resistance. The effects for the Iberian Peninsula and for what will eventually become known as the Spanish and Portuguese empires is this anxiety over orthodoxy in the population and whether people believe and practice the right things. One of the ways that the Spanish and Portuguese empires and also other Catholic countries will attempt to enforce this orthodoxy or correct belief system, correct practice, is by creating what's known as the Inquisition. And of course, the most famous Inquisition is the Spanish Inquisition, but it's basically a religious court that is conducted by priests or monks, in some cases bishops. There are hearings, there are punishments, and the Inquisition in Spain was originally created to basically make sure that people were not secretly practicing Islam or Judaism. And in fact, many people were practicing these religions in secret. Many of them actually migrated to the New World because in Spain it was well known that they came from Jewish or Muslim families and had converted. And in Spain, there is kind of a stigma against those families, as sort of what today we would refer to as a kind of racism or xenophobia. At any rate, that is sort of the religious conflict that really organizes the expansion to the New World. The Inquisition, these religious courts are taken into the Americas, and they're used to force or enforce correct beliefs among the Native American population. So, in some ways, this is a very violent and very authoritarian force that's moving into the New World. So the second thing, about the Protestant Reformation is that it will create a sense of rivalry between Protestant and Catholic countries in the quote-unquote New World, which is something else that I'm going to talk a little bit about today, and also in some of the subsequent lectures on British and French and Dutch colonization. So the other thing I want to think about is as demographic crisis. And this is something that I'm actually not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about because it's covered by Alan Taylor, and he does give us a little bit of demographic information about Europe. The most important demographic crisis in this period is the recovery of the European population after the Black Death or the Black Plague. The Black Plague wipes out a huge, substantial number of Europeans. In some places, the number is as high as 2/3 of the population are killed by this disease. There is a huge labor shortage, and it creates a crisis in the European economy, which is mostly agricultural based. And as a result, you see people crowding into urban centers, or more or less urban centers. We're not talking about huge cities. We're talking about towns and villages that are, 10 or 20,000 at their very most. Those would be like the largest cities in many regions. So at any rate, there is a shift in some ways from the country to the city. This also breaks down the a medieval feudal structure where serfs are tied to the land. If there aren't enough people to work the land and they have to work these other jobs or move to the village, then obviously this system is unsustainable. So you start to see the slow death of feudalism in the 14th and 15th centuries. And as the European population rebounds, as cities get more and more crowded, there needs to be a place to move them. Beginning very early in the colonial process, beginning in the 1500s, European rulers realized that the quote unquote New World could be a place to send what is considered to be a kind of an excess population, right? The other aspect of conquest is technological innovation. And in some ways, this is about discovery of how the currents work. Columbus uses some of the innovations of other sailors who had realized that the currents in the Atlantic Ocean create a kind of conveyor belt, and that if you catch them at the right time, if you catch these currents at the right time, they will simply carry you across the Atlantic and then right up the east coast of the present day United States and shoot you right back to Europe. It's almost like a circle, right? This Atlantic current. At any rate, sailors are starting to understand how these currents work in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, and this helps Europeans to establish reliable trade routes that allow them to send ships across the Atlantic. This is a very perilous journey, but within a few decades of Columbus's arrival in the Caribbean, Europeans know how long it takes to get across the ocean. They generally know how to navigate this massive body of water. And a lot of that technological innovation comes from understanding how the currents work. The other piece of technological innovation comes from sailing technology. Until about the 1300s or the 1400s, European sailors are mostly concentrated in the Italian peninsula, and especially in the northern Italian peninsula. Cities like Genoa and Venice have these huge ports, and sailors travel back and forth between these European ports and ports on the coast of North Africa, and also the ports along the Levant, present day Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, what today we refer to as the Middle East. This region, of course, is also the site of the Crusades, so the Crusades kind of play into this as well. The Crusades have ended a couple of hundred years before this process really begins. In some ways, this interchange means that Europeans will adapt sailing technology from other places. The Arab caravel, which is a ship that's used by Arab merchant traders in the Mediterranean and on the Indian Ocean, allows for speedier travel, faster travel, and the Portuguese begin to adapt this technology in the 1300s and 1400s, and as a result, they can sail a lot further. So the other piece of that, though, is that the Crusades really disrupted a lot of the merchant trade routes that had connected European port cities, especially in northern Italy, but not only in northern Italy, to the Islamic world, to China, to India, to these other places where the most desired goods and the most valuable goods in the European economy come from. And this is really important. Europe is a very impoverished society compared to the regions I just mentioned. Manufacturing lags far behind. It's basically an agricultural society. There's very small scale production and not a lot of scientific innovation really until the 1500s or 1600s, a lot of which, again, is borrowed from the Islamic world or from exchanges with China. So at any rate, the disruptions of the Crusades had made Christians, and especially Christians associated with the Catholic Church, a little bit unwelcome, as you can imagine. And so as a result, they begin to look for other trade routes. And this is what kind of empowers Portugal, which is on the very, very western tip of Europe, to become the new center of navigation and sailing in the 1300s and 1400s. And essentially, all of these sailors from Genoa and Venice, these cities in northern Italy, moved to the west coast of Portugal because they are undisturbed by Arab sailors who may not like the fact that these people associated with the Crusades are showing up in their lands uninvited. So at any rate, the west coast of Europe sort of becomes the new frontier, so to speak. And the Portuguese almost immediately take advantage of their position on the west coast of Europe and start sending ships out. The rulers of Portugal, the most famous is a ruler named Henry the Navigator. But rulers of Portugal, even before Henry, had invested heavily in these ships, knowing that they could potentially create a new market of exchange between the East and Western Europe that could bypass some of those shipping ports in the northern Italian region. So at any rate, it's a little bit about competition between these different European powers. The final thing is luck. In some ways, when you look at this history, you realize that the sailors and conquistadors who survived these shipwrecks and showed up into areas where there had been ecological devastation just a century before, or when they showed up and everybody had died of European disease even before Europeans showed up, like that's really lucky. They are not a people who are terribly sophisticated or strategic. They do learn a lot and they're sort of savvy. But this tendency to think of colonial navigators and explorers as these brilliant, strong-willed, individual genius men really overlooks the fact that they were aided by circumstances. That's luck, right? And nothing else. So at any rate, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on each of these slides because they do correspond to our readings in other ways, and I've also contributed some of my notes to these slides. But I wanted to give you a little bit of a visual picture of what some of this process looked like, and give you also just kind of a timeline for early Spanish colonization of the quote-unquote New World. And I will talk a little bit about the Portuguese, so I've kind of grouped those together as the sort of Iberian world or the Iberian expansion. Take a look at this map. This is from 1346, about 1350, right? The period about 150 years before Columbus's first voyages. This gives you a little bit of a sense of what Europe looks like. And one of the things you might notice is that very few of the countries you might recognize from a European map today are present on the map in the 1350s. Spain does not really exist yet. It is still these different independent kingdoms. If you're looking at the Iberian Peninsula, you can see present-day Portugal, right? So Portugal exists. But Spain is made up of the Christian kingdoms of Navarre, Aragon, and Castile. You can kind of see those in the northern part. And then on the southern tip is Granada, and that is a Muslim kingdom. At one point, the Muslim kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula actually controlled the entire peninsula. But several hundred years before, Christian kings and princes and the Catholic Church had started pushing south along the mountain region that separates present-day Spain from present-day France. And so you can see how far they've gotten by 1350. They've almost pushed these Islamic kingdoms completely off the map. It will take another 100 years, and by 1492, this process, which the Spanish call the Reconquista, the reconquest, is complete. One of the other things that you might notice is this big region called the Holy Roman Empire. That's a little bit of a misnomer. You might imagine like a Holy Roman Emperor who is controlling this entire region. There is a Holy Roman Emperor, but he is basically a figurehead, right? He does not really make that many decisions throughout the Holy Roman Empire. If you were to zoom into this and look at the divisions within the Holy Roman Empire, you would see tons and tons of little city-states and country regions, most of which are controlled by bishops or princes or these dukes and margraves and other kinds of titles. At any rate, this is a pretty disunified region. In the mid 14th century, in about 1350, all of Western Europe is Catholic. Eastern Europe, though, practices a different form of Christianity, Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And by the way, Catholics and Orthodox Christians do not see themselves as belonging to the same set of religious practices. In fact, during the Crusades, Roman Catholic Christians had attacked Orthodox Christians in the city of Constantinople, which becomes Istanbul. You might also see in the corner region in Southeast Europe, you'll see a little green spot that says Biz. This is the Byzantine Empire, and the Byzantine Empire will not last a whole lot longer. It's actually the remnants of the Roman Empire in Eastern Europe. It had succeeded after the fall of Rome, and its capital was Constantinople. It's a Christian kingdom, but again, it's Eastern Orthodox, right? Or Greek Orthodox. It is not connected to the Roman Catholic Church. There's a lot of rivalry between these two kingdoms, and in the 14th century, in about 1350, this kingdom has about 100 years, a little less than 100 years to live. Right next door is what's referred to in this map as the Ghazi Emirates. In the 1400s and 1500s, this would become the Ottoman Empire, what is now centered around present-day Turkey. The Ottoman Empire is an important Islamic a kingdom or empire that occupies much of southeastern Europe and gets actually very close to Central Europe, moving all the way up through Hungary in the 1500s and 1600s. In the Holy Roman Empire, you have the outbreak of a Protestant Reformation. There are also other, Catholics call them heretical movements, but other kinds of Protestant movements throughout Northern and Central Europe. So, this in some ways explains some of the geographic pressures that Catholic Iberian rulers feel themselves to be under. One of the things that you're reading about in Alan Taylor's book is that the King of Spain, or what will ultimately become Spain, also is crowned the Holy Roman Emperor. That's why I brought up this region earlier. So by the 1500s, when the Spanish conquistadors are very, very active in the quote-unquote New World, the King of Spain also has to manage this very unruly region where there's a hotbed of Protestant rebellion going on. So we are talking about a Europe that is fractured, that's divided into these very small kingdoms. Some larger kingdoms are beginning to consolidate. In other regions of Europe, order is totally breaking down, and you have religious pressures coming from every which direction. So what did Europeans know about the world outside of Europe? Not very much. And in fact, Europe is a very sedentary society. Most people are still in an agricultural economy, and most Europeans have not left like the 10-mile radius from where they were born. There are some explorations into Central Asia and East Asia. Obviously the merchant connections between northern Italy that I just mentioned and the East are well established by the time Columbus begins his voyages. So, there is some knowledge of the outside world, but a lot of it is very fantastic. Mandeville's travels are published, well, not really published, but they're written, right? They're written by hand. They're sort of manuscripts. In the 14th century, in the 1300s. And this is kind of a map of what he describes. You'll notice some things are familiar, some things are not. He describes a region where there are monsters. So this kind of gives you a little bit of a view of what Europeans might have imagined the world to be like if they were reading somebody like Mandeville. This just gives you a little bit more information about Mandeville, and I included my notes here, so you might press pause so that you can read this. This just kind of gives you a little bit more context of who he was or probably wasn't, right? It seems like Mandeville probably never lived. It seems like these travel accounts were written and gullible readers took them as real accounts, including Columbus, right? So, the other famous account from this period is Marco Polo. Marco Polo had voyaged to China and supposedly served in the court of the emperor. We're pretty sure that Marco Polo existed, and, even if his accounts are not totally factual, they're certainly more accurate than Mandeville's accounts. So, Mandeville has these monsters, these unusual beings. And one of the things this suggests to us is that Europeans looked at the outside world and they had no clue how it really worked. Instead, they had a lot of fears, they had a lot of fantasies. So you can imagine how they applied some of these ideas to Native Americans or to Africans or to Asians when they encountered them. In some ways, these accounts in Mandeville that describe these fantastic creatures create space in the European imagination to imagine this idea that there are some beings that are human-like that are not quite human. This is an idea that feeds into the notion of race and white supremacy, right? So it's very interesting to think about the traces and the links between what Mandeville says about these fantastic creatures and how, for example, Europeans see African bodies and their potential in the New World as working bodies, as reproductive bodies, as bodies that can be used and exploited by the colonial project. This image just shows a little bit of the ridiculousness of Mandeville. This is from one of the original manuscripts. So these manuscripts are written by hand and they're copied by hand and then passed around Europe. This shows the wolf-headed creatures that garnered so much attention from these travel narratives. And this gives you an idea of how far-fetched Europeans are whenever it comes to the outside world. Here we have a man-eating dragon, right? I got no clue, right? Where does this come from? Where do these observations come from and these myths and these ideas come from? We don't really know. This is one of my favorite images from some of the early manuscripts of Mandeville. So you see in the corner, Christians arriving at the court of a king. This is in the bottom right-hand corner. In the top right-hand corner, you see like kind of the menagerie of creatures that are described in Mandeville. This actually is a lithograph, so this comes from maybe a century or two after the original manuscripts were published, which tells you also how long-lived they are. So you see like the woman with one eye, the child with two heads, the people that walk on their heads and their feet are where their heads should be. The people with torsos, torso faces. I mean, it's just totally fantastic, right? My favorite image, though, is the one with the sheep. Europeans did not have cotton, and cotton was not very common in Europe. Most cloth was woolen, so it was made from livestock. Cotton was extremely expensive, and cotton varieties at the time were pretty stingy. So it took a lot of it, and it took a long time to make and to process. And mostly, cotton is made into linen. It's very expensive. And this kind of textile is traded with Middle Eastern and South Asian traders. So it's not uncommon, but it's very rare, right? This cotton textile. The other major textile is, of course, silk. And silk is a very valuable commodity that is produced in China, and it's produced secretly. Europeans don't know how it's made. It's sort of the secret that the Chinese emperor maintains that Europeans will not figure out for a long time, right? At any rate, the idea of what cotton is a plant with a little sheep in it, and the sheep bends down once a day and takes a sip of water, and then it becomes this woolly little plant. So, once again, Europeans are taking some ideas that are coming from the natural world and they're amending them to their own purposes. So, maybe the man-eating dragon is like an alligator or something, who knows? But these are some of the ways that Europeans adapt these ideas to their own imaginations. One of the other things that's really important to this history is something that I described earlier, which is the discovery of how currents and winds and rivers work. In some ways, the navigational practices of Europeans in the 1300s and 1400s, it's a lot of trial and error. But by the 1500s, the first century of colonization, they have really kind of figured out how these currents work. Columbus is responsible in part for figuring out the Gulf Stream, as it's known, which is the conveyor belt that I referred to earlier. And so you can kind of see how ships would move across the Atlantic. Without that, you get stuck. You get stuck in what sailors call the doldrums, where your ship doesn't move. You run out of water, you run out of food, and eventually you die, right? Or the sharks get you, or whatever. This had probably happened. Well, it had definitely happened to a number of ships in the quote unquote discovery era in the 1300s and 1400s. And so it's part of the popular mythology that Europeans thought that sailors would fall off the edge of the earth. That's not quite true. Europeans are naive, but they're not that naive. So the idea that all Europeans believed in a flat earth is not quite accurate. Europeans who were educated and had elite, what we would consider elite or expert knowledge, knew that the world was round. We're not entirely sure when the very first ships began to arrive in what are referred to as the Atlantic Islands. That's like the Madeiras, the Canary Islands. Further south, it's not pictured on this map, you'd be able to see Cape Verde. But we know that Portuguese ships started arriving as early as 1302. Now, when I say Portuguese ships, this is really complicated because most ships are international. There are people from all over Europe who speak all kinds of languages who join these voyages. And as I mentioned before, a lot of sailors, a lot of navigators come from the northern Italian ports of Genoa and Venice, including Columbus. Columbus is Genoese, right? At any rate, a lot of these ship's captains are not actually Portuguese, but they are flying, or rather sailing under the banner of the Portuguese flag. And eventually, the kings and queens of Castile and Aragon, the biggest Christian kingdoms on the Iberian Peninsula, will also begin to send their own sponsored voyages. And so between about 1302 and 1492, these areas are completely colonized. The local populations are completely displaced. Most of them are killed by smallpox and by disease. Survivors of these, virgin soil epidemics are often killed in military conquest, and many others are sold into slavery. Some aspects of Guanche culture survive, including the kind of whistling communication language that still exists in parts of the Canary Islands. But for the most part, this culture totally went extinct because of European colonization, and it happened so rapidly. It happened very quickly. Part of this is also the ecological aspect of colonization, not just the ecology of disease and microbes, but Europeans also brought animals with them, including grazing animals, and so the local vegetation was wiped out fairly soon after the arrival of the Europeans. There are some areas of the Canaries and the Madeiras that have never really recovered. They still are kind of these deserty landscapes. You'll see a couple of those images here coming up. And this shows a region that has been kind of desertified, and it has never quite recovered. This was a region that was desertified because of goats and goat and sheep grazing. So you can see how big this area is, right? And one other thing, just as a clarification, not all of the islands in the Atlantic are inhabited, but the Canary Islands are. And this is really kind of the Guanche homeland. And this image shows the conclusion of the Guanche conquest. In the 1490s, the very last of the Guanche rebels kind of surrender, and they are taken captive and they're brought to Spain before Ferdinand and Isabella. And here they are, as, like kind of in chains, right? And I believe they all died in the capital of disease shortly after arriving. What ultimately brought the Europeans back to the Canary Islands and the Madeira over and over and over was the prospect of developing agricultural colonies. The European demand for sugar at the time is very high, and sugar is a very difficult product to get. Sugar cane does not really grow in Europe. So you can obtain it through trade, but that's really the only way. Otherwise, Europeans have to rely on saps and honey to sweeten their food. So, sugar is in high demand. Wine is also in high demand. And it turns out these islands are perfect for growing certain varietals of grape and also for sugarcane. So very quickly, the Spanish realized that they need lots of workers to work these lands. Initially, they try to put the Guanche population to work, but it does not work. They bring in indentured servants, and ultimately they also import enslaved people from Africa. And so within a couple of hundred years, parts of the Canary Islands and the Madeira Islands are converted into these very rich agricultural lands. And today, this is still an important sugar producing and wine producing region of the world. As I mentioned before, Europeans brought these ecological agents with them that were just as destructive to indigenous populations as any military campaigns or, sort of active murder. In many cases, populations were weakened by diseases that spread through their communities well before the Spanish arrived. When the Spanish show up in the Inca zone to try to conquer the Inca have already suffered the consequences of European disease, and they've never even set their eyes on a white person before. It's hard to describe how terrible smallpox is. This is an image of a little girl suffering from smallpox in the early 20th century. In Europeans and among Africans where the disease is more endemic, it's not quite as bad, but these poxes, right, these marks on the body, are also covering the mucous membranes. It can cause hemorrhagic fevers and other kinds of complications. And in some communities, as many as 90% of the population are killed by smallpox wiping through. This is really what is responsible for wiping out the Guanches, and more than any other agent is responsible for killing Native Americans in the New World. Not only did it actively kill people, but it also left people in a weakened state. So when the Spanish show up and they say, well, you have to do what we say, people comply. What's your choice? Oftentimes the Spanish show up with medical care, right? And so, you comply with their wishes so that they can provide some kind of therapies, even if they're not very effective. So the other thing that the Spanish brought with them are dogs and pigs and sheep and goats, and these big domesticated animals are quite violent. And so, the Spanish mastiffs that they brought with them, first to the Canaries and then to the Americas, are these big, massive dogs. 150-pound dogs that come right up to your shoulder. They will kill you. Horses are also extremely dangerous. People get killed accidentally by horses all the time just because they're behind them and they get kicked. So you can imagine what it's like to have somebody on horseback charging into your little village, or even your big, gigantic Tenochtitlan-sized city, it's just kind of a bombardment of these different ecological agents. Until the establishment of Spanish colonies in the Americas, Spain is not really a major economic or political player, and in fact, it doesn't really exist. Spain is created when Isabel and Ferdinand get married. They are king and queen of their respective kingdoms. Isabel is the Queen of Castile, and Ferdinand is the King of Aragon. These are sort of rival kingdoms, and I mean, sort of rival, right? They're both Catholic Christian kingdoms, but they occupy different territories, and they join together when Ferdinand and Isabella marry, and then their children inherit what becomes known as the Kingdom of Spain. And of course, their kids also marry into the royal family of the Holy Roman Empire, and Ferdinand and Isabella's grandson becomes ruler over this big area. But that's later, right? That's way, way, way after this period that we're talking about. We still haven't got to the Americas yet. We're still in 1450, about 40 years before. So Spain is not Spain, but Portugal is Portugal, and it is easily the most powerful and wealthiest kingdom, wealthiest political region, and economic region in Europe at the time. The Portuguese had created new sailing routes to the west after sailing routes to the east had been cut off. In some cases, Portuguese sailors and merchants reestablished friendly relationships with rulers and countries that had been soured on Europeans because of the Crusaders. So, at any rate, you can see some of these trading routes as they existed in the middle of the 15th century. So, one of the questions might be why? Well, why didn't the Portuguese go to the Americas? They didn't need to. They already had all of this other stuff, right? And when you look at where they are trading, you can kind of get a sense of what they are trading as well. So on that west coast of Africa, the Portuguese are really developing, slave markets, right? When you look at what's coming from India and China, you have these manufactured goods that are extremely rare. So at any rate, this is a very, very wealthy trading empire. Whoever controls it has a lot of goods at their disposal. And so this is sort of the navigational world just before Columbus sets sail. This map shows the geography of the Reconquista, which I already described. And again, the Reconquista concludes just before Columbus sets sail. And in fact, not Elizabeth, Isabella and Ferdinand see the conquest of the New World, what they call the New World, as a piece of the Reconquista. The Reconquista had created this Christian kingdom in Iberia, and now Ferdinand and Isabella are going to sponsor the spread of Christianity to the New World. So they take many of the same techniques they used against Muslims and Jews in Spain, and they deploy those in the New World. So they have the Inquisition, they use the military, they use a combination of tactics, right? Carrot and stick in order to get the local population to convert to Christianity. But if they don't, then they will die, right? And ultimately, there's a statement that's read as part of the Reconquista, and then it's read again as a part of the conquest of the Americas. It's called the requerimiento, the requirement. And this requirement is that you declare your duty and fealty to the King and Queen of Spain, and you declare your belief in Christianity and solely Christianity, right? So in a lot of cases, especially in the context of the Americas, the Spanish would read the requirement, right? And they would read it out in Spanish, and the local population is looking at them like they're speaking Martian because they might as well be, right? And the conquistadors consider this to be, done, and they invade, right? So it's a very, in some ways, like it's sort of kind of a cynical exploitation of religion in order to put people under colonial rule. Columbus knows how religious these rulers are, especially Isabella. And so when he brings them this plan, he had actually gone to the Portuguese already and he said, you should sponsor this voyage. There's great stuff across the ocean. I'll find another route to India. It'll be faster. And the Portuguese are like, no, I'm going to pass. You might want to think about Columbus as like a startup, right? So he is an entrepreneur who is looking for investors. The big investors at the time are the kings and queens. So the Prince of Portugal says, no, buzz off, right? I don't want to invest in this. I already have my own projects going on. And so Columbus goes to Isabella and Ferdinand, and he appeals not only to their sort of commercial sensibilities, right? This is something that will make you wealthy, but he also says, this will guarantee you a place in the kingdom of heaven. You will be the evangelists of the new world. You will be spreading the good news of Christianity, Catholic Christianity, right? And so you can see here the king and queen are giving Columbus a Bible, right? So the Reconquista is really sort of ended with what's known as the Alhambra Decree. It's basically this moment of defeat, and as people either prepare to leave, they're moving to present-day Morocco, or stay, they are given this ultimatum by their new rulers. And this ultimatum is, well, you have to convert if you want to stay. And if you don't convert, you will die. A number of people stay behind. They have ties, they have communities, and so they convert to Christianity. Even though they convert, their surnames indicate that they had once been Muslim or Jewish. Everybody in the community kind of knows everybody because we're not talking about a huge society. And as a result, the people who are sort of former Muslims and former Jews living in this new Christian kingdom are stigmatized against. And in some cases, they practice their religion in secret and they sort of hide out. In some cases, these practices are even brought to the quote unquote New World. But for the most part, they're just harassed. A large number of people who are stigmatized in this way will travel to the Americas because there's much less stigmatization. So finally, we get to Columbus, right? Columbus leaves in the late summer of 1492. He shows up in October of 1492, and he makes contact with Native Americans. It's almost immediately a violent conflict where he takes Native Americans captive. He brings them to Spain. He makes all kinds of suggestions about this new population. They'd make great slaves. I'm not really sure if they could be converted to Christianity. He has a more or less belligerent attitude towards Native Americans, and in some ways, this attitude is reflected by others that come after him. Columbus is important mostly because of his influence on other sailors and merchants. He is sent back into the Americas by Ferdinand and Isabella, but he's not a great leader. His men don't like him. There are several revolts and complaints back to the administrators in Spain that he's not very good at what he does. He's eventually fired by Ferdinand and Isabella, but he writes this account of the quote unquote discovery of the Americas, and this is what really kind of makes him famous. This is also a blueprint that some of the other conquistadors we read about follow, including Hernan Cortez. So they publish these books, and they're like memoirs or autobiographies, and they become mad bestsellers. Everybody's buying these books, certainly everybody that wants to go to the quote unquote New World. And so this is where they get their ideas about what the people are like and how I should behave myself. And if you think about Europeans coming after Columbus, they didn't really behave much differently. In some ways, you think about Columbus and you look at what he says, you look at his letters, you look at the primary source documents, and you realize, oh, this guy drew up the blueprint for the genocide of indigenous peoples in the Americas. And ultimately, from Columbus's initial voyages, some of those crew members will find their way to central Mexico and eventually into present-day Peru, and they will essentially colonize these massive civilizations there and create these as new parts of the Spanish Empire. Almost immediately after Columbus gets back from the Caribbean, the Portuguese become very interested in the quote-unquote New World and the Western Hemisphere. There's sort of a dispute between Portugal and Spain, which is sort of an upstart country but has this new power, has discovered these new worlds, and Ferdinand and Isabella have also provided basically security for the Pope. There's a lot of civil and military conflict on the Italian peninsula at the time. So at any rate, the Pope is between a rock and a hard place. He also depends on the largesse and support of the King of Portugal. So he essentially sits down. This is 2 years after Columbus shows up in the Americas, by the way. He sits down with diplomats from Spain and Portugal, and they have a big map in front of them, and he basically draws a line right in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. He says, this meridian is the division of the world, and everything to the west of this meridian belongs to Spain. Everything to the east of it belongs to Portugal. And it basically, gave Portugal control over Africa, over Asia, really the richest parts of the empire. It's not really clear that there's anything hanging over this meridian. The Europeans have not discovered they have not discovered Brazil yet. But that's the part. If you look at this map, you can almost imagine a line that goes through Brazil, right at the tip of the Caribbean, and that technically belongs to Portugal. And so they begin colonizing what will eventually become Brazil, starting in 1500 under a ship's captain named Pedro Cabral. Cabral shows up in 1500 and does not really do much. There's a lot more going on in other parts of the world. And so it takes, 2 or 3 decades for the Portuguese to start sending more and more people into the region. The Dutch also will try to colonize the north coast of Brazil near present-day Recife. The conquest of the Caribbean begins almost immediately, from the time of Columbus's arrival. It is a bloody conquest. In some cases, the entire indigenous population is wiped out on some islands, and this sort of reaches its height in 1511 and 1512, when the sort of Spanish colonials really make a concerted effort to take over Hispaniola and Cuba. Hispaniola is where present-day Haiti and the DR are. So, at any rate, one of the leaders of Hispaniola, his name is Hatue, he escapes as the Spanish are burning his society down, and he travels across the Caribbean to, not completely across, but just a few dozen miles to Cuba. And he shows up in Cuba and he says, beware, the Spanish are coming. And so as a result, the Cubans, or the indigenous Tainos and Arawakan speaking people of Cuba, kind of put up a resistance. And the conquest of Cuba was very bloody. It was an extremely militaristic conquest. And eventually they caught Hatue. Hatue is sentenced to die. He's sentenced to burn at the stake. And while the Spanish are burning him to death, the priest comes to give him his last rites. And he says, would you like to confess? And he says, why would I do that? And he says, well, would you like to convert to Christianity? He says, well, what's in it for me? And he says, well, you can go to heaven, right? And he says, well, I don't want to go to heaven and be with all these awful Spaniards, right? And so he says, screw your religion and just kill me and get it over with. And that is what happens, right? One of the people who had supposedly witnessed Hatue's death was a priest named Bartolome de las Casas, who would later become known as the Apostle of the Indies. And according to Las Casas, these practices are driving Native Americans away from Christianity, and it's undermining one of the central aims of the colonial project. This creates the conditions for a set of reforms that are described in your book and that I'm going to describe in just a moment. Cuba becomes the launch point for expeditions further into the interior, and the Spanish begin showing up in North America and present-day Mexico in the 15 teens, very early. The person who is most responsible for the creation of what becomes New Spain, which is sort of the new center of the Spanish Empire in the Americas, is an adventurer named Hernan Cortez. And Cortez is a little bit of a wildcat. He sort of does his own thing, doesn't listen to orders. And without authorization, he had already gone into the interior of Mexico several times before he launched a full-scale conquest between 1519 and 1521. And this is described in your reading, so I'm not going to say a lot about it, but I wanted you to see this image. This shows Tenochtitlan as the Spanish are invading. And this is that second night as it's described in your primary sources. Ultimately, though, the Spanish succeed because the Aztecs have become very, very unpopular with other local regions. And so ultimately, Cortez teams up with a Tlaxcalan ruler named Chico Tencatl, but he also relies on the advice of a woman whose name is Doña Maria, and today she's known as La Malinche. She was a woman who had been a captive. At one point, she had been from Aztec society, so she spoke Nahua. She was Cortez's his mistress, his lover. I mean, it's hard to describe these relationships. Whatever their relationship was like, and I'm sure it was coercive, right? Which is why it's kind of gross to call them lovers. But whatever their relationship was, Cortez fathered a child with La Malinche, and according to sort of legend and popular culture, their child is, sort of the hybrid that is sort of the birth of modern Mexico, right? So it's interesting because Malinche sort of means like the cursed one. So there's a lot of ambivalence about the origins of Mexico. There's a lot of Mexican writers and Chicana writers in the United States who talk about these complex origins in this sort of hybrid moment where the Spanish and the Aztecs confront one another in Tenochtitlan. At any rate, the conquest of Tenochtitlan is completed by 1521, and the rechristened Mexico City becomes the launch pad for expeditions further into North America, into the present day United States, and also further south into the Yucatan Peninsula and into the Maya zone. The other major conquest from this period occurs in Peru, and when the Spanish show up, the Inca had already had a number of crises. For one thing, they'd had a wave of European disease about a decade before they even saw Europeans. This is likely what had killed one of the major rulers in Peru at the time, and because there's a dispute between his sons, there's basically a civil war that breaks out in the Incan Empire between 1531 and 1532. And basically there are two brothers, Huascar and Atahualpa, and they are both vying for power. They are both taken captive in 1532. And Atahualpa is sort of ransomed by the Spanish. Atahualpa actually has his brother Huascar killed, so they're in some kind of protective custody where Atahualpa has power over Huascar's life. And the reason he does this is because he does not want to have to pay a ransom for Huascar. He is also, his rival. Atahualpa is trying to get full control. At any rate, the Spanish demand this huge ransom for Atahualpa, and so his soldiers bring in enough gold to fill up a room. Pizarro is a double crosser like most colonial administrators, and he goes back on his word, and he has Atahualpa garroted, basically strangled to death with a wire or string. So at any rate, when he dies, Huascar's followers are very happy about it. One of the things this maybe should suggest to you is that, once again, Europeans may have seen Native Americans as all the same, but Native Americans did not see themselves as the same, right? Aztecs are not the same as Teotihuacanos, are not the same as Tlaxcalans, right? Within the Inca community, even the followers of two different brothers see themselves as diametrically opposed. But ultimately, the Spanish are able to take advantage of these divisions, and they are able to establish their own authority. And that's exactly what happens in Peru, which very quickly becomes one of the wealthiest regions in the Spanish Empire. The Spanish are not always successful, right? And so three of the expeditions that are described in your book, the De Leon expedition from Puerto Rico to Florida, the Narvaez expedition to Florida, and the Coronado expedition through present-day New Mexico and Colorado and Texas and Oklahoma and Kansas, all kind of end in failure. De Leon and Narvaez, ends up in like mass death kind of thing, right? Coronado is just frustrated because he can't find the gold that he is promised. And again, these are sort of detailed in your readings. I think the most interesting person to come out of these sort of failed expeditions north, though, is Cabeza de Vaca. Cabeza de Vaca and Esteban, or Estevanico, who is an enslaved man, are, they must have been like these sort of linguistic geniuses because they pick up Native American languages very quickly, and as a result, they're able to communicate with Native Americans. And they have this, really long, years-long odyssey where they basically travel from the Gulf Coast of Florida all the way to near present day El Paso. So they travel all the way across the present day southern United States in Texas. And all along the way, Cabeza de Vaca keeps this really interesting account that serves as an important ethnography of the New World, or again, what the Spanish are calling the New World. I hate that phrase, and I hate that it's worked its way into my vocabulary. So I apologize if it continues to come up in these presentations. At any rate, this is a really rich account of languages, religious practices, knowledge systems in these different cultural regions. And one of the really interesting things about Cabeza de Vaca is he's not really very judgmental. He doesn't have the same kinds of attitudes that are reflected in other writings at the time. Part of this is probably because Cabeza de Vaca's life depended on his Native American captors, and he was a captive. He and Estevanico and the other survivors of the Narvaez expedition are sort of being traded from group to group. But ultimately, Cabeza de Vaca comes away with this sort of sense of esteem. So Estevanico is enslaved, and so he winds up back in Mexico, and his slave master, his enslaver rather, wants to get the gold that's supposedly in these northern regions. And so Estevanico is sent with this expedition into present-day New Mexico. But the local peoples mistake Estevanico or think he's hostile. It's not totally clear what happens, except that he's killed, right? And so this process kind of peters out. Coronado also travels through the region with this huge military retinue, and he makes a lot of enemies with Native Americans. He does chart a lot of territory. He creates kind of a map, but he doesn't really ever create any kind of foothold. The real legacy of Coronado is the creation of what's called El Llano Estacado, the staked plains. And these stakes are markers that are put in the ground throughout mostly West Texas and eastern New Mexico. And so I grew up on the Llano Estacado, so I'm super familiar with this history. But there are high schools and stuff like that named for Coronado. At any rate, Coronado comes back home empty-handed, right? And he's told by Native Americans, there's this beautiful village, right? It's made out of gold. It's called Quivira or Cibola. It has different kinds of names, right? And so he shows up and he demands to know where it is. And the Native Americans are kind of like, it's just over the next hill, but it's 100 miles away, right? So we also know that Native Americans know that the Spanish are up to no good, and they, keep them moving, right? Keep moving along, guys. Another place where the Spanish really sort of failed to establish a colonial control is in the Maya zone. And the Maya conquest is one of the most bloody, but it's ultimately one of the most unsuccessful. The Mayans were definitely admired by the Spanish when they first arrived. They were impressed by their knowledge, but they also thought they were, heathens who were going to hell, and they, needed to convert and start practicing the ways of the Spanish or die kind of thing. So the Spanish show up in the 1520s and 1530s, and in a couple of communities, they create inquisitions and burn Mayan books and objects and kill people. But the Yucatan is not very penetrable. It's not easy to move around. And so the Mayans kind of hide out. They are stubbornly resistant to the Spanish. They are not really persuaded by their attempts to convert them to Christianity. And it's really about 200 years. It's right about 1700 when the Spanish are able to get control over this territory. And even then, it sort of remains in sort of a perpetual revolt. The Mayan revolt or the Yucatan revolt of the 19th century is a sort of this long-standing indigenous-led rebellion against Euro-American control in the region. So, even today, like Mayan language survives. A lot of these practices have survived because of the resistance of these communities in the Yucatan and present-day Central America. One of the central figures in sort of the legal reform or administrative reform of the Americas is a priest named Bartolome de las Casas, who I referred to earlier. Las Casas wrote a number of books that were published in Spain in the 1520s and 1530s that detailed Spanish atrocities, and they're very graphic. It describes people being killed. It describes women having babies ripped out of their wombs and babies' brains being bashed against rocks. He wrote about what he saw. He talked about Hatue's death. He also wrote books about American civilizations before the arrival of Columbus. And he says, these are not a savage or unsophisticated or uncivilized people. They have cities that rival our own. They have learning and knowledge that is superior to the Greeks and the Romans, right? So Bartolome de las Casas begins this campaign in the Catholic Church and also in the Spanish government to reform the treatment of Native Americans. So one of the suggestions he makes is to import more slaves from Africa, and so he inadvertently leads to or not inadvertently, I mean, that's on purpose, right? He is responsible in part for the acceleration of slavery in the Spanish Empire. Las Casas' books are also very popular outside of Spain. And right in the middle of this is something I'll spend more time on in a different presentation. But right in the middle of this, the Protestant Reformation occurs, right? This is sort of a long event, but it really starts in 1517. So Protestants are looking at what's happening in the New World, and they are seeing evidence of, like Catholic aggression and evil towards the Native Americans. And they read the accounts of Bartolome de las Casas, and they say, look, this is from their own priests, right? Like, this is crazy, what the Spanish and the Portuguese are doing in the New World. So this is an illustration from a book called The Destruction of the Indies, written by Las Casas, that was reprinted in Northern Europe and in Western Europe. By the 1540s and 1550s, a number of Christian kingdoms in Northern and Central Europe had become Protestant, and some of them, like England, right, like the country that will eventually colonize what becomes the United States, will say, we can do a better job of this because we're Protestant and our belief system is superior. This won't have a meaningful impact in the short term. But in the long term, it means that Protestant countries will try to compete with Catholic countries to better convert the Native Americans. And one of the things that we'll see is that Protestants are no better at containing the violence of colonialism than Catholics. And in some cases, it's much worse, right? If you look at Catholic regions in the Americas, you find a population that's multiracial, multi-ethnic. Why is it that when you look at Protestant parts of the New World, like everybody's white, right? Or they're divided very carefully into different racial categories that aren't supposed to mix with one another, like white, black, Native American. So there's some complicated reasons for this, but that's one of the things we're going to explore over the next a couple of weeks. Ultimately, Las Casas' writings lead to a passage of the new laws in 1542, which creates the encomienda system that's described in your reading. So the new laws essentially place control of Native Americans under the priests. So it kind of shifts from conquistadors, from military leaders, to the priests. And it creates a system where the Native Americans will work on missionary farms as opposed to encomiendas, which are basically slave plantations, right? And in some ways, this is seen as a labor reform. It's seen as a reform that will lead to widespread support from Native Americans. In fact, it's enacted pretty unstably, and so it's not ultimately the most effective instrument. And this is just a timeline that shows some of those expeditions by year and by date. And I've described on the left side some of the expeditions that are highlighted in Alan Taylor. So take a look at this, give it a pause. You also see that treaty line of Tordesillas. In some ways, this map is sort of where we end up, right, in about 1600. And that's about where we'll pick up in some of our next presentations.